She went up the mountain just to disappear, but found a hidden room no one had touched in decades. Inside wasn't just money, it was something that could change an entire community and force her to decide to walk away, or finish a story someone else never could. If this story pulled you in even a little, hit like and subscribe. It really helps more stories like this find the right people. And if you think someone else needs to hear this, feel free to share it with them. I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I read more of them than you'd think. Mara wasn't the kind of person people worried about right away, and that was exactly why no one noticed how far she had drifted. She didn't fall apart in visible ways, didn't call friends in the middle of the night, didn't post long messages about feeling lost. She just kept going, quieter each month, like someone slowly turning down the volume on their own life. At 24, she had already stepped away from an architecture program she once loved, not because she failed, but because somewhere along the way it stopped making sense to her. Buildings, plans, deadlines, they all felt like they belonged to a version of her that no longer existed. When her father got sick, everything shifted without warning. Time became measured in hospital visits, insurance calls, and the quiet tension of waiting rooms. Then, just as quickly, it was over. He was gone, and the apartment they had shared turned into something unrecognizable, too full of memories to stay, too empty to feel like home. She didn't make a big decision to leave. There was no dramatic moment, no packed car at sunrise. She just took what she could carry, closed the door behind her, and didn't come back. For a while, she told herself it was temporary. A few weeks, maybe a couple months, just enough time to reset. But weeks turned into seasons. She moved through different towns the way some people scroll through channels, never staying long enough to settle, never connecting deeply enough to be missed. She worked wherever she could: a coffee shop off a highway exit, a small motel where she cleaned rooms between check-ins, a seasonal job helping repaint cabins near a lake. None of it was terrible. None of it meant anything either. The strange part was she didn't feel completely broken, just disconnected, like she was watching her own life from a slight distance. Conversations felt rehearsed. Smiles came a second too late. Even rest didn't feel like rest, just a pause before the next thing she didn't really care about. What she did notice, though, was where her attention kept drifting. Not to people, not to cities, but to spaces, empty ones. She found herself staring at maps whenever she had the chance. Old paper maps pinned to walls, digital ones on borrowed computers, even faded atlases in second-hand shops. While other people looked for destinations, Mara traced the areas in between, the blank stretches, the mountain lines, the places where roads thinned out and eventually disappeared. She couldn't explain it, but those places felt honest. Like they weren't trying to be anything other than what they were. It was in a small town library, somewhere she had stopped mostly to get out of the cold. That something finally caught her attention in a different way. The building was quiet, almost too quiet, with that faint smell of paper and dust that made time feel slower inside. She sat at one of the public computers, scrolling without much intention, half looking for work, half avoiding the thought of needing it. That's when she saw the listing. It wasn't featured or highlighted. Just a simple notice buried on a local government page, an abandoned weather monitoring station located in a remote mountain region, available for long-term lease under special conditions. Most people would have ignored it. It didn't offer comfort or convenience, no electricity, no maintained road access during parts of the year. No guarantee the structure was even fully safe. The description almost felt like a warning, as if whoever wrote it expected no one to say yes. But Mara didn't read it that way. She read it slowly, then again, then opened a map and searched for the location. It took time to even find it. When she finally did, it was just a small, nearly invisible point surrounded by contour lines and forest. No nearby towns. No main roads, just elevation, distance, and quiet. For the first time in a long while, something inside her felt clear. Not excitement exactly, but direction. There was no obvious reason this should matter to her, and maybe that was exactly why it did. It wasn't tied to her past, didn't ask her to be who she used to be, didn't require a plan she didn't have. It was just there. A place that existed whether she went or not. She spent the next few days thinking about it more than she expected. Running through the practical concerns, even though she didn't have solid answers for most of them. How would she get there? What would she live on? What if it didn't work? The questions were real, but they didn't stop her. If anything, they made the idea feel more solid. For the first time in months, she wasn't just reacting to life, she was choosing something, even if it didn't make sense to anyone else. What she didn't fully realize yet was that this decision wasn't just about finding a place to stay. It was about stepping into a space that would ask something of her. A place shaped by someone else's time, someone else's effort, someone else's quiet commitment. And whether she knew it or not, she was about to inherit more than an empty building on a mountain. She was stepping into a story that hadn't quite ended, and one that would quietly challenge her to become someone she hadn't been in a long time, present, responsible and connected again, not just to a place, but to the people who had come before her. Mara didn't decide right away. That's what made the decision real. It wasn't impulsive, wasn't driven by some sudden burst of courage or desperation. It stayed with her for days, quietly sitting in the back of her mind, while she went through the same routine, waking up in a place that didn't feel like hers, working a shift she didn't care about, eating meals she barely tasted. But now everything felt slightly off, like she had already stepped away without physically moving. The listing for that abandoned weather station kept pulling her back in. She would open it on her phone during breaks, reread the same dry description, zoom into the same patch of mountains like there was something new hidden there each time. There wasn't. That was the point. It didn't change, didn't try to convince her. It just existed, waiting or not waiting, it didn't matter. What made it different from everything else in her life was how little it asked from her on the surface, and how much it demanded underneath. There were no promises, no version of things will get better, just conditions, remote access, no utilities, responsibility fully assumed by the lessee. It sounded less like an opportunity and more like a test. And for some reason, that honesty made it easier to trust than anything polished or comfortable. She started doing something she hadn't done in a long time, thinking things through, not to avoid action, but to prepare for it. She found a printed map at the library and traced the route with her finger, estimating distances the way she remembered from school, calculating elevation changes even though she knew it wouldn't be exact. The nearest road ended miles away. From there it looked like a narrow service trail, possibly overgrown, cutting through forest and climbing toward the ridge where the station sat. She asked a librarian if there was any more information about the place. The woman didn't know much, just that it had been decommissioned years ago, and no one had taken responsibility for it since. Too far, I guess, she said with a small shrug, like distance alone was enough to explain why something was abandoned. Mara nodded, but that answer didn't feel complete. Places weren't just left behind because they were far. People left them behind. Decisions did, time did, and somewhere in that gap, things got forgotten. That idea stuck with her longer than she expected. Over the next week, she started gathering what little she could without fully admitting to herself that she had already made the decision. She saved more than usual from her shifts, skipped small expenses, bought things that could last: dry food, a basic flashlight, extra batteries, a cheap but sturdy backpack from a second-hand store. Nothing about it looked dramatic from the outside. If someone had asked, she could have said she was planning a trip. But internally, it felt different. There was a quiet weight to it, like each small action was part of something that couldn't be undone once it started. The hardest part wasn't logistics, it was the absence of certainty. There was no one to ask for advice, no clear outcome to imagine. She didn't know if she would stay a week or a year. Didn't know if the structure would even be usable. Didn't know what she would feel once she got there. But for the first time, not knowing didn't feel like a reason to stop. It felt like the reason to go. Her life had become too predictable, in the worst way: safe, contained, and completely disconnected from anything meaningful. This at least had edges. When she finally reached out to the local office managing the property, the process was almost disappointingly simple. A short call, a few questions, a waiver that made it very clear she was responsible for her own safety, and a minimal fee that felt more symbolic than transactional. The man on the phone didn't try to sell it. If anything, he sounded mildly surprised anyone was interested. "You understand there's nothing up there, right?" he said, not unkindly. Mara paused for a second before answering. "Yeah, I think that's the point." There was a brief silence on the other end, then a quiet, "All right," like he had heard something in her answer he wasn't expecting. After that, everything moved quickly. Not because she rushed, but because there was nothing left to delay. She gave notice at the place she had been working, packed what she owned into a single bag, and bought a bus ticket that would take her as close as possible to the base of the mountain range. The morning she left didn't feel like a big moment. No music, no sense of closure. Just a gray sky, a half-empty bus, and the steady realization that she wasn't coming back to this version of her life. As the miles passed, the landscape began to change. Cities faded into smaller towns, then into long stretches of road lined with trees and open land. Signal dropped in and out. The world felt less crowded, less defined. By the time she reached the last stop, it was already late afternoon. The air was cooler, thinner somehow, carrying that faint smell of earth and pine that only shows up away from everything else. There wasn't much there, just a small roadside area, a few parked trucks, and a narrow path that disappeared into the trees. She stood there for a moment longer than she needed to, adjusting the straps of her backpack, looking at the trail like it might give her some kind of answer. It didn't. It just waited. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't hesitate because she was afraid. She hesitated because she understood what this meant. This wasn't just a different place. It was a different way of being. No distractions, no easy exits, no one to blend into. Just her, the path, and whatever she would have to face along the way. Then she stepped forward. By the time Mara reached the station, it was already late in the day. The kind of late where the light turns softer, but everything feels sharper at the same time. The trail had taken longer than she expected, not because it was impossible, but because it demanded attention. Loose rock, uneven ground, stretches where the path nearly disappeared and had to be guessed more than followed. She wasn't used to that kind of focus anymore. It slowed her down in a way that felt unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. When the trees finally thinned and the structure came into view, she almost missed it at first. It didn't stand out the way buildings usually do. It sat low against the landscape, weathered, quiet, like it had learned not to expect to be noticed. Up close, it looked exactly like something that had been left behind on purpose. The paint had long since faded into a dull, uneven gray. One side of the roof sagged slightly, not dangerously, but enough to show time had done its work. The door was still there, intact but worn, and one of the windows had a crack running through it like a thin vein. There were no signs, no markings to explain what it had been. If you didn't know, you might have thought it was just an old storage shed or a forgotten cabin. Mara stood there for a minute, not moving, just taking it in. It wasn't disappointment she felt. If anything, it was a strange sense of recognition. Like this place made sense in a way nothing else had for a long time. Inside, the air was stale but not unbearable. It smelled like dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic. The space was small, simpler than she imagined. A central room with a heavy table bolted to the floor, a few shelves along the wall, and equipment that had clearly been outdated long before it was abandoned. Everything was coated in a thin layer of time, nothing destroyed, just untouched. She set her bag down near the wall and walked slowly, not because she was afraid, but because it felt wrong to rush. This place had been someone's routine once. Someone had worked here, sat at that table, looked out those same windows at the same ridgeline. The thought settled in quietly, without drama, but it stayed. She spent the first hour just opening things, cabinets, small compartments built into the walls. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: old tools, weather logs, scraps of paper that didn't mean much anymore. There was no dramatic discovery, no immediate sign that this place held anything beyond what it appeared to be. And strangely, that didn't disappoint her. If anything, it grounded the experience. This wasn't some hidden treasure waiting to be found. It was a place that had simply been left, and she was the first person in a long time to step back into it. It wasn't until she started cleaning that things shifted. Not in a sudden, cinematic way, but gradually, the way real discoveries tend to happen. She moved one of the shelves slightly to sweep behind it, and that's when she noticed it didn't sit flush against the wall. At first, it seemed like nothing, just uneven construction. Maybe the wood had warped over time. But when she pushed it a little more, there was a hollow sound that didn't match the rest of the structure. She stopped. Not out of fear but curiosity, the kind that builds slowly and then refuses to let go. She ran her hand along the wall, feeling for seams, edges, anything that didn't belong. It took a few minutes before she found it a section of paneling that was just slightly different from the rest. Same color, same material, but not quite aligned. The nails were older, slightly rusted, but placed in a way that looked deliberate. Not random wear, intentional. Whoever put it there had meant for it to stay hidden, but not impossible to find. That detail mattered more than she expected. It meant this wasn't an accident. It took effort to remove it. The wood resisted at first, the nails holding longer than they should have, but eventually one corner came loose, then another. When the panel finally shifted, a narrow space revealed itself behind the wall. Not large, just enough to store something protected from the elements and from casual discovery. Mara didn't rush. She sat back for a second, catching her breath, not because she was tired, but because she understood the moment. Whatever was inside had been placed there by someone who expected time to pass. Maybe a long time. Inside the hidden space was a metal box, the kind designed to keep out moisture. It wasn't locked, just sealed tight. When she pulled it out, she noticed the weight immediately, not heavy enough to be something large, but enough to mean it wasn't empty. Alongside it were a few worn notebooks, edges curled, pages yellowed but intact. She picked one up first. The handwriting inside was steady, consistent, not rushed. Dates, observations, notes about weather patterns, small personal comments scattered between the lines. It wasn't just data. It was a record of someone paying attention day after day, year after year. When she finally opened the metal box, she expected something simple: tools, maybe documents. Instead, she found a small stack of cash, carefully wrapped, along with a USB drive sealed in a plastic sleeve. For a second, she just stared at it, not reacting the way most people would. It didn't feel like luck. It felt intentional. Like she had stepped into something that had already been set in motion long before she arrived. She didn't count the money right away. That wasn't what held her attention. It was the combination of things: the notebooks, the care in how everything was stored, the fact that it had been hidden but not erased. Whoever left this behind hadn't been careless. They had chosen this exact spot, taken the time to protect it, and then walked away. And now, years later, she was standing there, holding something that didn't belong to her, but had somehow been left for someone like her to find. For the first time since she arrived, Mara felt something shift inside her, not excitement, not even relief, but a quiet sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about what she had found. It was about why it had been left in the first place. And standing there in a room that had been silent for years, she realized she wasn't just alone anymore. Not in the way she had been before. Mara didn't make a decision about the money that first night. She didn't suddenly feel rich. Didn't start planning what she could do with it. Didn't even count it properly until the next morning, when the light came in through the cracked window and made everything feel a little more real. What stayed with her instead was the notebooks. She sat on the floor with one of them open, flipping through pages slowly, noticing how consistent the handwriting was, how deliberate each entry felt. It wasn't just data, it was attention. Day after day, someone had taken the time to write things down that most people would ignore: wind shifts, temperature changes, cloud formations, small patterns that only mattered if you stayed long enough to see them repeat. That realization hit her harder than the cash ever could. Whoever had been here hadn't just worked here. They had committed to it. Over the next few days, Mara settled into a rhythm without really planning to. She cleaned first, not because she cared about making the place look good, but because she needed to understand it. Dust turned into structure, clutter into layout. She figured out which parts of the roof leaked slightly when it rained, which windows stuck when the air got damp, how the door needed to be lifted just a little to close properly. These were small things, but they mattered. They made the place feel less abandoned and more unfinished, like it had been paused, not ended. She set up a basic living space in one corner, laid out her sleeping bag, organized the little food she had, rationed it without overthinking. The money stayed in the metal box for now, tucked back into the hidden space. That choice wasn't dramatic, just instinctive. It didn't feel like something she should carry around, not yet. Instead, she focused on the USB drive. It took her a while to find a way to check it. She had to hike back toward a small town a couple of days later, using one of the public computers at a local center that still had a functioning port. What she found there: Chi. The drive was filled with files, years of recorded weather data, manually logged and then digitized. But it wasn't just numbers. There were notes attached to entries, small observations that didn't fit into official reports, mentions of unusual rainfall patterns, earlier frost seasons, subtle shifts that wouldn't matter to someone passing through, but meant something to someone who stayed. There were also a few short video recordings, not polished, not meant for an audience. Just a man speaking directly to the camera in a quiet, steady tone, explaining what he was seeing, why he was recording it, what might happen if no one paid attention. His name was Daniel Harper. He had been the last technician assigned to the station. In one of the videos, he said something that stuck with her longer than anything else. If you only stay somewhere for a short time, everything looks the same. It's only when you stay long enough that you start noticing what's changing. It didn't sound dramatic when he said it, just matter of fact. But hearing it there, in a place where almost no one came anymore, it felt heavier. Mara realized that what he had left behind wasn't just information, it was a record of care. A way of saying this mattered, even if no one else thought it did. When she hiked back up to the station, everything felt slightly different. Not physically the same worn walls, the same quiet, but in how she moved through it. She started paying attention the way he had, noticing the way the wind shifted in the afternoon, how the temperature dropped faster once the sun dipped behind the ridge, how certain areas held moisture longer than others. She didn't suddenly become an expert, but she became present. And that changed things. The idea of leaving started to feel less obvious. Before this had been a temporary escape, a place to disappear for a while. Now it felt like something else. Not permanent, not yet, but meaningful in a way she hadn't expected. She thought about the data on the UZ, about how it could still be useful. How patterns like that didn't just disappear because someone stopped recording them. If anything, they became more important. She remembered the small town at the base of the mountain, the people there who relied on predictable seasons, on knowing when the weather would turn. It wasn't hard to connect the dots. A few days later, she made the hike down again, this time with a purpose. She found a small environmental research group that worked out of a modest office near the edge of town. It wasn't a big organization, just a handful of people tracking regional climate data, trying to make sense of changes that didn't always show up in official reports. When she told them about the station, about the data, they didn't dismiss her. If anything, they leaned in, asked questions, looked through some of the files she had copied. What Daniel had recorded filled gaps they didn't even realize existed. Years of consistent observation from a single location, something that's incredibly rare. That was the moment things shifted again, but this time outward. It wasn't just about her anymore. The station wasn't just a place she had found, it was a point of connection. Between past and present. Between someone who had paid attention and people who still cared enough to continue that work. She didn't hand everything over and walk away. That didn't feel right either. Instead, she offered to keep going. Not formally, not with a contract or a title, but as someone who was already there, already paying attention. Back at the station, she started keeping her own records. At first, it felt strange, like she was imitating someone else's routine. But over time, it became her own. Her handwriting wasn't as steady, her notes weren't as precise, but they were honest. She wrote what she saw, what she noticed, what felt different from the day before. And slowly, almost without realizing it, she stopped drifting. Her days had shape now. Not imposed from the outside, but built from something real. The money in the metal box eventually became practical. She used some of it to improve small things, basic supplies, better tools. A simple solar setup that allowed her to keep a light on after dark and charge a device when needed. But she didn't treat it like a reward. It felt more like a resource that had been passed along with everything else. Something to be used carefully, with the same kind of attention that had gone into preserving it. What changed the most wasn't her situation, but her relationship to it. She was still in a remote place, still living simply, still far from the life she had once imagined. But she wasn't disconnected anymore. She was part of something, even if it was small. She was continuing a line that hadn't been broken, just paused. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. By the time the first winter started settling in, Mara realized something had changed in a way she couldn't easily explain to anyone else. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment where everything suddenly made sense. It was quieter than that. It showed up in small things, how she woke up without that heavy feeling in her chest. How she moved through the day with intention instead of just reacting to whatever came next. How silence no longer felt like something she had to escape. The station hadn't fixed her life. It had simply given her a place where she couldn't avoid it, and strangely, that had done more for her than anything else ever had. She thought about leaving sometimes, not in the same restless way as before, but as a real option. The money was still there, enough to start over somewhere more comfortable if she wanted. She could go back to school, find a job in a city, rebuild something that looked more like a normal life. And for the first time, that idea didn't feel impossible, but it also didn't feel necessary. The difference now was choice. Before, she had been drifting because she didn't see another way. Now, she stayed because she understood why she was there. The research group began relying on her more than she expected. What started as occasional data sharing turned into regular communication. She'd hike down every couple of weeks with updated records, notes, and small observations that didn't always fit into charts helped tell the bigger story. Patterns started to emerge: subtle shifts in temperature, longer dry periods followed by sudden, intense storms. Nothing that would make headlines, but enough to matter to the people living in the surrounding areas. Farmers adjusted planting schedules. A few early warnings helped prevent damage during an unexpected cold snap. It wasn't heroic work, it was quiet, consistent, and real. What surprised Mara most wasn't that she was capable of doing it. It was that she wanted to. Not because someone told her it mattered, but because she could see the impact, even if it was small. For so long she had felt like nothing she did connected to anything beyond herself. Now, even in a place this remote, her actions had weight that changed how she saw everything, even the past. She went back to the notebooks often. Not just to reference data, but to understand the person who had come before her. Daniel Harper wasn't a mystery anymore. Through his writing, his voice in those recordings, the small details he chose to document, she began to understand him in a way that felt almost personal. He hadn't stayed because it was easy. He stayed because he believed attention itself had value. That noticing things, really noticing them, was a kind of responsibility. And by leaving everything behind the way he did, he hadn't been trying to disappear. He had been trying to make sure the work didn't. That realization shifted something deeper in her. It wasn't just about continuing what he started. It was about respecting it. Respecting the time he had put in, the care he had taken, the decision he made to leave something behind instead of letting it vanish. And in a way, it made her more aware of her own place in that line. She wasn't the beginning of the story, and she wouldn't be the end of it either. That took pressure off in a way she didn't expect. She didn't have to make this place into something extraordinary. She just had to take care of it well enough that it could continue. Spring came slowly, the way it does in higher elevations. Snow melted in patches, the ground softened, and the air shifted from sharp cold to something lighter, almost hesitant. Mara noticed everything. The first time she heard running water again near the rocks behind the station. The way the trees seemed to change color almost overnight. The return of small sounds that had been missing all winter. These weren't things she would have paid attention to before. Now, they felt like markers, proof that time was moving and she was moving with it, not against it. One afternoon, while organizing some of the older materials, she found a loose page tucked between two notebooks. It wasn't dated, just a short piece of writing in the same steady handwriting she had come to recognize. It wasn't about weather, it was about staying. About how most people think leaving is the hard part. But sometimes staying, really staying, is what requires the most from you. There was a line that stood out to her: a place doesn't ask you to belong to it. It asks if you were willing to show up for it. She read that line more than once. It didn't feel like advice. It felt like a question. And without thinking too much about it, she already knew her answer. Mara didn't become someone completely different. She didn't turn into a perfect version of herself or suddenly figure everything out. She still had days where things felt uncertain, where the future looked just as unclear as it always had. But those moments didn't define her anymore. They passed the same way weather passed, something to notice, not something to get stuck inside. What mattered was that she had found a way to stay present, to take part in something that extended beyond her own experience. Months later, when someone new made the hike up to the station, a curious traveler who had heard about the place through word of mouth, Mara found herself standing on the other side of the story for the first time. She offered them water, let them rest, answered their questions the same way she had once asked her own. When they asked how she ended up there, she didn't give them the full story. Just the simple version. "I found it," she said. Then, after a pause, she added, "and I decided to stay." That was enough. Because the truth was, the station hadn't been waiting for her in some mystical way. It had simply existed, carrying the weight of everything that had happened there before. And when she arrived, she had a choice. To pass through, like so many others might have, or to recognize what had been left behind and treat it with care. In the end, that was the real value of what she found. Not the money, Not even the data, but the understanding that places and people deserve to be seen fully, not just used or left behind when they become inconvenient. That respect isn't something abstract. It shows up in attention, in consistency, in the willingness to continue something even when no one is watching. Mara had spent years feeling like she didn't belong anywhere. What she learned, standing in a quiet station on a mountain far from everything else, was that belonging isn't something you find all at once. It's something you build, slowly, by choosing to stay, to care, and to carry forward what others trusted you enough to leave behind. And for the first time in her life, that was enough. I think what stays with me most about this story isn't the hidden money, or even the discovery itself. It's the quiet shift in what value really means. We were used to thinking that something matters only if it's visible, profitable, or recognized by other people. But this story pushes against that idea. It shows that meaning can come from something much simpler, and honestly, much harder: paying attention, staying consistent, and respecting what came before you. Mara didn't find a miracle that saved her life overnight. What she found was a responsibility. And instead of running from it like she had with everything else, she chose to stay. The choice, simple on the surface, is actually what changed everything. Because staying meant she had to face herself, her habits, her tendency to drift. It meant she had to care about something beyond her own survival. And in doing that, she slowly rebuilt a sense of purpose that no job or quick fix could have given her. I think there's something really human in that. A lot of us aren't lost because we lack options. We lost because nothing feels worth committing to. We move on too quickly, avoid discomfort, chase clarity before we've earned it. But this story reminds us that clarity doesn't come first. It comes after you've stayed long enough, paid attention long enough, and cared long enough to see what actually matters. And maybe the most important part is this: Mara didn't own that place just because she found it. She respected it. She continued what someone else started. In a world where people are quick to take, use, and leave, there's something powerful about choosing to preserve, to continue, to not let something meaningful disappear just because it's inconvenient or unseen. So if there's one thing to take from this, it's not go find your own mountain or wait for something extraordinary to happen. It's simpler than that. Look at what's already in your life, what's been left unfinished, overlooked, or undervalued. Maybe it's a relationship, a skill, a responsibility, or even just a part of yourself you've been avoiding. Instead of walking away, try staying, try paying attention. Try showing up consistently, even when it's quiet and no one notices. Because sometimes, the thing that changes your life isn't something new you discover. It's something that was already there, waiting for you to take it seriously.